Hey everybody, it is Friday. Welcome to Friday Fix. I'm Doc NYC Artistic Director Tom Powers. We invite you to participate throughout this show. We encourage you to go over to the chat box and introduce yourself, tell us where you're viewing from. If you have a question for our guests throughout the show, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will try to get to those questions segment by segment. This is episode 10 of our series. I want to remind you that past episodes of Friday Fix are now available for free on the Doc NYC website at the Doc NYC Fest YouTube channel. And we'll put a link in the chat box so you can see what's going on there. Let me bring myself to a full screen for a second. Our show today is going to be divided into 3 segments as usual, each around 20 minutes. First up will be Dawn Porter discussing her new film, John Lewis, Good Trouble, about the civil rights crusader and congressman. Second guest is Sam Feder discussing his new film, Disclosure, about transgender representation on film and TV. And our third segment will have Judith Helfand. Her latest film is Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, that will be rebroadcast on PBS's Independent Lens next week in honor of the 25th anniversary of the deadly 1995 Chicago heat wave. Before I bring up our first guest, let me tell you a little bit about Dawn Porter. She started out as a lawyer inside ABC News and A&E, reviewing content. Mid-career, she gave up that job security in order to make her own films as an independent filmmaker. The first one was Gideon's Army, about public defense lawyers, that debuted at Sundance in 2012 and was featured on the Doc NYC shortlist that year. And we'll put up links to her projects in the chat box so you can bookmark them for later. Dawn's second film was Trapped, or second feature film anyways, was Trapped, about the erosion of reproductive rights in America. And she was honored for that film at the 2016 Doc NYC Festival with the Robert and Ann Drew Award for Documentary Excellence. She discussed both those films, Gideon's Army and Trapped, on my podcast, Pure Nonfiction. And she came back to Pure Nonfiction to talk about her Netflix series a couple of years ago, Bobby Kennedy for President. Her new film is a profile of Georgia Congressman John Lewis. It was originally intended to premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival, followed by a theatrical release from Magnolia Pictures. That's the same company that released I Am Not Your Negro and RBG. But we all know the pandemic got in the way of that. And so instead, Magnolia released the film on VOD last week, where it enjoyed a lot of support. I saw Hillary Clinton tweeting about it, and Cher tweeted about it, and I'm so happy that people are getting to watch this film. I'm going to play the trailer for the film. I just need to get myself set up here to do that. All right, let's watch the trailer. Really?
Member of Congress. Everybody knew what he had done. He was John Lewis.
Sorry, we had audio issue there. I'm just gonna take it back and let you hear from the beginning.
My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
He was always different than every member of Congress. Everybody knew what he had done. He was John Lewis.
We're marching today to dramatize to the world that hundreds and thousands of Negro citizens denied the right to vote.
Congressman Lewis gave us the blueprint to organize and to legislate.
The reason why he's effective as a leader is because he lived it.
We made a decision to march in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion from Selma to Montgomery.
Your order to disperse this march will not be fixed.
was hit in the head. My knees went from under me. I thought I was going to down the bridge.
If John Lewis, as a 19, 20-year-old, wasn't doing what he did, I would not be here.
We used to march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have strong here today.
The whole time he was in the movement, it was frightening, knowing the danger, knowing what could happen.
You cannot replace a John Lewis.
He's the most courageous person I ever met.
Too many people struggled and died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote.
He challenges the conscience of the Congress.
Bring common sense gun control legislation to the House floor.
40 years later, John Lewis continues to inspire us.
Are you with me? Let me hear you. Three civil rights workers have been murdered for trying to help people get registered to vote are looking down on us.
This is a time for action. That's what I learned from John Lewis.
There are forces in America today want to take us back, but we're not going back. We're going forward.
All right. All right. Look at you already here, Dawn. Thank you for being here.
I know how you feel about time, Tom.
So it's, I'm sitting right now in Montclair, New Jersey, where my wife and I moved in 2011 because we were invited to start the Montclair Film Festival. And when we were invited to that job, I can think of one person I knew in Montclair, and that was Dawn, who is a great welcomer to us in this community. Lived just down the street from us for a couple of years until she moved. And now right now she's joining us from Martha's Vineyard.
And now people ask me if I lived in Tom's town, which, yeah, there you go.
I know it's a sore point. So let me ask you about this the John Lewis project. So was this something that you initiated, or was it something that was brought to you?
It was brought to me by CNN. I think they had a lot of success with their RBG film, and so we
Let's get another one of those.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, who else is 80 and out there? So but it came at a good time because I just finished the Bobby Kennedy series, and the marvelous Kahani Cooperman had done an interview for me with Congressman Lewis that we included in our series. And, that interview was one of the most important that we did. And it showed, John Lewis told a story that he hadn't told before. And I think it kind of woke people to the idea that there were many more stories to be told. And there were a few projects about him, but he hadn't really been, centered in very many films at all. So it was a great opportunity.
So, it was announced back in December that John Lewis has pancreatic cancer. And, at that point you were finished with the project, but how did that news affect your thinking about the project?
Whenever you work with a person who's older, it's always in the back of your mind that you don't know how much more time you have with them to get these stories. And we certainly saw that with the civil rights movement. During the making of this film, Congressman Elijah Cummings passed away. He was the first person that we interviewed for this film, and we were unable to show the finished film to him. So there was definitely a sense of urgency. I also, at the time we started, we thought like, oh, this might be his last, term in Congress. So we were always, and when we started, I said, Congressman, are you going to run again? And he said, oh, Dawn, I can't keep doing this forever. I just can't keep doing this. And then kind of the middle, he's like, oh, there's so much work to do, but you know, it's time to pass the torch. And by the end, he was like, I got more work to do. So, you know, he didn't announce, he's on the ballot now. He just won his primary. So he didn't retire, but it was always kind of in the back of my mind that, you know, the people won't be here forever, and let's capture these stories while we can.
Makes me wonder what happens to his seat when he goes. What's the process?
So if he dies while he's in office or before the election, then there would be a special election to fill that seat. So, you know, he is battling pancreatic cancer. He's still working, you know, he's still voting, and he's, you know, he's gonna fight as long as he can. So, you know, but it is a safe Democratic seat though. So there's not a chance that a Republican would take it over, but there would be a special election.
I think you had a special chance to see him recently. Can you describe that?
You know, well, I went and showed him the film before, you know, before we all shut down. I went to his home, and you know, it's always anxiety provoking when you go show a subject your film. And you know, he had just been diagnosed. I knew he was undergoing chemotherapy, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. But I get to his house, and he's dressed up like he always is, and we watched the movie together, and he just kept saying, it's so powerful, it's so powerful, you know. And I said, gosh, your life is powerful. But then we you know, we both like cried a little, we laughed a lot, and then we just had 2 hours just visiting, you know, like kind of old-fashioned Southern visiting, very peaceful, very quiet. So and he, you know, just was telling stories, and I'm like, why didn't you tell me this when we had camera? But, you know, like filmmakers, we're always greedy, you know, there's always something else. But it was really special to be able to share that with him, even if it was just my laptop in John Lewis's living room in DC. So, and then, you know, we've spoken since. He's in Atlanta now, you know, at his home there, and his staff is with him and his family. So, you know, he's comfortable. He watched Joy Reid. I was on Joy Reid last week, and he sent me a picture of him doing the thumbs up. So he's a great person. He's really fun, and we had a lot of fun doing this. He has a great sense of humor, and so I really enjoyed being with him.
Now, his story has been told in different renditions over the years. There's a 3-part comic book called The March that he wrote. What were the things that you were trying to draw out in his story, and what are you, when you look at the film, what are the moments that you're proudest of?
I really wanted, you know, people are familiar with that time on the bridge. They're familiar maybe with the fact that he was instrumental in organizing the Freedom Rides, or maybe they knew that he spoke at the March on Washington, although that's really less well known. But I really wanted to focus on the strategy of the activist. You know, John Lewis and civil rights activists are famous for being brave, but I wanted to focus on how intentional they were, how much training and planning and organizing went in. And it's really just a politically genius, you know, examination of political genius. So I wanted to focus on that, on their intelligence, because I think, you know, part of deconstructing racism is to think about how we describe people. What terms do we use? And if we just point to bodily bravery, that does not tell the whole story of what it actually took to make this lasting change. So that was one thing. You know, the other thing was because I could just come off of the Bobby Kennedy series, we had actually started to collect like cool archival moments. And the archivist, Rich Remsburg, that I work with a lot, he, like, after we finished Bobby Kennedy, he sent me a list of, he's like, okay, here are some other archival deep dives that have not been explored. And there was quite a bit of footage of John Lewis that we found because we were looking at civil rights and Bobby Kennedy and civil rights. So we kind of had a running start by the time CNN came to me. So I'm really, really proud that, you know, as the congressman says in the film, there's footage that he'd never seen before.
Yeah, that's a nice moment.
Yeah, and you know, what I did with that is, you know, as you say, like John Lewis has been interviewed thousands of times, and you know, people tend to start to tell the same stories over and over and use even the same language. There's, you know, there's a beauty to that. That very much harkens to an oral tradition in the Black community of repeating things and making sure they're passed along. But I wanted to bring him up, you know, get him off book a little bit. So one of the things, Jessica Congdon, who edited the Dolores film, you know, one of the things we did is we created kind of a mini film for the congressman. It was all archival moments. And then we rented the arena stage near his house in DC, brought him in there, constructed 3 giant screens and had him watch and then tell me the story. And once he did that, I was like, oh, John Lewis needs to tell his own story, you know? And so that's why I had him look right at the camera and start the film that way and have him appear periodically, because that means you can't ignore him. He's looking right on at the camera and he's telling you what he wants to emphasize. And I think he does it, you know, really, really beautifully. So I'm really proud of that. And then the second thing I'm really proud of is the score. We worked with Tamar Kali, who is new to film scoring. None of you can have her, she's busy. It's nothing like a little like competitiveness. But she had scored the film Mudbound with Dee Rees. And, you know, I spoke to her about how important the land is to the congressman. And then I asked her to write a modern spiritual. I was like, John Lewis, one of the things I want to do is draw that connection between past and present. And so she really did that beautifully with the music. So that was a really fun, creative, you know, part of what we did.
We had a question. Millie Burns is asking about your transition to being a filmmaker. As I described in the introduction, you'd spent many years as a lawyer. And I will say that you and I talked a lot about this on my Pure Nonfiction episodes too. And so I'd encourage people to listen to that for more. But, you know, can you just talk a little bit about, you know, was it always in the back of your mind to become a filmmaker? What was that transition like for you?
It was not in the back of my mind at all. It was not in the front. It was not in the back. It was not in the middle. Like it was, my father was a photographer, and, you know, we used to make Super 8 films when I was little. And I was always attracted to photography. So, and then I was attracted to journalism. And then I realized, I'm like, oh, you can make these pictures talk. But, you know, it was really working at ABC, working at A&E and thinking I could do this. Like, why don't I just do it myself? So it was a long road, and you should listen to episode 2 because Tom and I do discuss it quite in depth there. But, you know, sometimes you have to take a risk. And I was at a point in my career as a lawyer where I was a little bit restless, and I wanted to make sure I was, as John Lewis says, like, you only pass this way once. And I was at a point where a close friend of mine had passed away, and I was really thinking about what I wanted my life to be. And I'm so glad I did, because I feel like this is the work I'm supposed to do. And there are just an infinite number of stories, and I'm really excited about, you know, the state of documentary right now.
Before I let you go, are you allowed to talk about what your next project is? I don't know if that's public or not.
I can, yes. Do you want me to just talk about it?
Yeah, say a word about your next project and
it is a film about Pete Sousa, Obama's White House photographer. We are just about done. Although, you know, we just did an interview with Samantha Power, which I'm super excited about. But Pete Sousa took 2 million photographs during his time in the 8 years of Obama's presidency. And those photographs will all eventually become public domain. But what they show is kind of the qualities of a leader, you know, empathetic, smart, hardworking. They also show what you grapple with. So, you know, I hope it's a film not just about the president, but about the office of the presidency. Sousa was also a photographer for Ronald Reagan. And so he has a really unique vantage point from which to evaluate just what does it take to make a good leader. So it's a not so subtle point to what we need in the White House and who we don't need?
Well, I've gotten a look at, early look at a rough cut.
And what do you think, Tom? Tell everybody what you think.
I've given Dawn some notes, but there's some great stuff. And I am really looking forward to that film this fall. It's a film that people are, I think, really going to enjoy in the middle of this election season and feel fortified for the fight ahead. Much like the John Lewis film. So you're delivering us two important films for this election season, and I thank you for that.
Yes, and now, you know, it's one of the great things about being a filmmaker. So you get to work out your issues, you know, in public. So.
All right, well, thank you, Dawn, for joining us, and get back to work.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Before I bring on our next guest, Sam Feder, I'm gonna say a couple words of introduction. He previously directed the feature documentary called Kate Bornstein is a Queer and Pleasant Danger, about the transgendered activist, author, and performer Kate Bornstein. I will pop a link to the trailer in there, but I definitely encourage people to check that out. His new film is Disclosure, about transgender representation in the history of film and television. He's described being inspired by documentaries like Celluloid Closet and Ethnic Notions that examined representations of homosexuality and Black culture, respectively. Disclosure premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and had many other festival plans that were disrupted by COVID-19. Now, happily, it's arrived on Netflix a week or two ago. Let me set up the trailer, and I think I know this time what I did wrong, so I'll try not to screw it up. Hang on. Boom. Boom. Boom.
I can't even tell you how many times I've been in public space, particularly early in my transition, when I would walk into a subway car and people would just burst into laughter. And I think people are been trained to have that reaction. According to a study from GLAAD, 80% of Americans don't actually personally know someone who is transgender. So most of the information that Americans get about who transgender people are, what our lives are and are about, comes from the media.
We've been around since there was footage. You just have to look for us.
Can we all just talk about D.W. Griffith for a minute? Not only is he incredibly racist, but he turned gender non-conforming people into the joke.
So it's like you can't have like queer trans people and blackness in the same space at the same time. So what's it say about my queer trans black ass?
They've died so many times they can't even count on camera.
I've been a prostitute 1, prostitute 2, call girl, hooker, you know.
The crying game created a ripple effect.
You are a trans person who existed, made people physically ill. Was the way in which my favorite movie as a child ended.
There are lots of ugly things about our history, but I think we have to know them.
I have been beaten. I have been thrown in jail for gay liberation, and you all treat me this way?
There is a one-word solution to almost all the problems in trans media. We just need more. And that way, the occasional clumsy representation wouldn't matter as much because it wouldn't be all that there is.
You see a fierceness that's coming up now. That's because we ain't got nothing to lose.
These are my sisters up here, but the struggle is real.
The ways in which trans people have been represented have suggested that we're mentally ill, that we don't exist. And yet here we are, and we've always been here.
All right, Sam, welcome. Just bring my video back to screen. Thank you for being here, Sam. I really enjoyed watching this film. I want to start with the title, Disclosure. You know, we hear in your film, it's a loaded concept, this expectation that trans people make some disclosure about who they are. Can you describe, what is so fraught about this word and this idea?
Well, hi, it's really nice to be here. Thank you for having me. So the reason the word disclosure is such a fraught concept and expectation is because it puts the onus on the trans person to disclose something to the non-trans person they're in conversation with, or anyone they're in conversation with, that's saying I'm not who I show up as, right? It's this idea that you're hiding something, that there is something to disclose, that you're not who you say you are. And that's what we see again and again in all these representations in film and TV, is that whether it's the joke or the villain or the sociopath, all of these stories point back to the same thing, that disavow that trans people exist, that we are who we say we are.
You've described that being inspired by Celluloid Closet. And when I was watching Disclosure, I felt I kind of came with that mindset of, oh, it's like going to be like Celluloid Closet, but excuse me. One difference that stood out to me is in Celluloid Closet, we see that depictions of gays and lesbians were mostly that of mockery or fear for several decades. But there are some bright spots, there's a Marlene Dietrich or a Gore Vidal, and as far back as 50 years ago, you had films like Boys in the Band or Cabaret. And I think Disclosure really shows that transphobia has taken a lot longer to grapple with. And up until very recently, trans characters have usually been psychopaths or prostitutes. I mean, do you feel that contrast, coming from thinking about Celluloid Closet and then making this?
Yes. When I first started doing my research, I actually got in touch with Jeffrey Friedman.
Yeah.
Friedman, thank you. I was just talking with my friend Sydney Friedland, so sometimes Friedman. So I got in touch with him, and he was so generous with his time.
Who made Celluloid Closet
yes,
along
sorry.
with Rob Epstein. Yeah.
Exactly, one of the directors. And he was so generous with his time and his advice. And one thing he said was, you shouldn't make this film now. And I was really taken aback. And he said, because you're doing it about something in the present, and Celluloid Closet was about something in the past. And so I've been thinking about that, all these years, and it certainly makes for a different story to be told and different stakes. And for me, it was the stakes that were so high that made it so important to tell the story now, to really try to, intersect this moment, and change the conversation.
Watching the film, I think it really gives a lie to this idea that Hollywood is a liberal place. We think of Hollywood as a liberal place, but watching your film and this representation of transphobia, makes me think of, other groups that have been so badly misportrayed, women, Black people, any marginalized community. And, I live in a film world where people are constantly celebrating film and constantly, regurgitating the nostalgia for film and for classic Hollywood and for all these things that, have a really ugly flip side, maybe a primary side that are represented in your film. I mean, I wonder how, you think about Hollywood as an institution, when you've had all this exposure.
That's a really good question. First off, I love that you said that the film is a representation of transphobia, because that's so true. And I usually just say it's a representation of trans people, but it's a representation of transphobia. So I just wanted to note that. One of the films that you mentioned earlier that was a big inspiration to this was Ethnic Notions, which is about the representation of Black people in film, made by Marlon Riggs, who was more known for his experimental films, Queer Black Man. And what that really left me with was that was a history of America. It was an American history film, right? You saw just the slightest shift of the lens, and it's a whole other history that we hadn't been exposed to, right? Because history's been told by white cis men. So that I really wanted to know what that history was for trans people. And, it wasn't a surprise to me looking at all of this history and gathering all the data. I mean, quite honestly, I looked away from mainstream media about 20 years ago. I kind of stopped taking it in. Is also when I started making films and I was really into the independent film scene and seeing those films, and it felt like those were really resonating and they weren't as harmful and painful as mainstream dominant media. And so collecting all this material and looking at the history of mainstream representation of trans people, you know, it was painful, and often there's things I still have to look away from, but it was really crystallizing and validating to see the roots of so much of the shame and the hate that trans people have taken in over their lifetime. And to say, you know, so often marginalized people are told they're too sensitive or they're imagining things, you know, the experiences they're having aren't real. And to see, I mean, it's not a one-to-one relationship between, you know, media and the violence we experience in real life, but to see some of the roots of this, it was very validating. Not only that these experiences are real, but also that there's a huge lack of imagination in Hollywood in telling our stories, you know, that these tropes and stereotypes are just repeated over again and again and again as a narrative device, which show again that trans people are not thought to be real. Our experiences aren't thought to be valid.
Your film is, you know, kind of centering mainstream representations. But you do cover a few documentaries. There's a film called The Queen from 1968, and there's, of course, Paris is Burning and the Brandon Tina story. I thought that maybe Southern Comfort from 2001 would come up, but that doesn't get mentioned. You know, can you talk about, you know, what you found in the history of documentary filmmaking and how you deliberated over your you know, what to include from that history?
I would love to make a film about specifically just the history of documentary storytelling around trans issues. I mean, like, that is where I come from. That is where my inspiration is. That's where I actually think about media the most. When I was preparing for this film, I expected there to be a lot more a documentary in it, but the research I did, because there was no book on this topic, right? Like the Celluloid Closet, Ethnic Notions, they had books. So I thought there would be, and I looked, and there was, you know, one small book that really, at best, was offensive. So it really was not helpful. So the way I knew it was very ethically precarious to document a history for the first time. And so I didn't want to do this in a vacuum. I didn't want to make the decisions on my own. So I interviewed 65, 70 different trans people who worked on one side of the camera or the other. And that's how I collected the information. And while, you know, these interviews were happening about 6 or 8 months, it just, again and again, it was Hollywood that came up. That was the collective memory, right? That's what everyone shares. And so that really steered the narrative of this project. It was through the interviews and the research I did with other people.
You show the way that people can evolve around this topic. You know, we see Oprah Winfrey earlier in her career, you know, doing clumsy at best interviews, and more recently in her career doing more sensitive interviews with trans people. Another case I think of is the showrunner Ryan Murphy. You use an example from his series Nip Tuck that has a real negative representation. And now, of course, he's the creator of the Pose series that's, you know, rightly celebrated in your project. I wonder, as your film is now on Netflix, or, you know, in the course of making it, you know, have you heard from creators who have been responsible for negative representations of trans people in the past express regret or embarrassment for that work?
No. I would love to. I can't say I'm surprised, considering earlier conversations that people have engaged in. It was really important to me to not demonize anyone in this project, you know, to show both sides of every story, but also hold people accountable and to do it in a loving way. You know, there's been so much conversation, especially this past week, around cancel culture and, like, you know, how we're trolling each other and dragging each other, but it's, you know, is it cancel culture or is it accountability culture, right? There are consequences to your actions culture. And so that, you know, I'm not interested in saying no one should tell anyone else's story except their own. I am interested in having a conversation about how we can do it better. And I think that's hard. You know, we live in a culture that is about crime and punishment. We don't get second chances. And I think it's really hard and scary for people to admit that they could have done better, they made a mistake in the past.
I mean, it's interesting because I think we see people going through a lot of reckoning around race right now and things that they, you know, feel they could have done better in the past. And I wonder if any of that will, you know, translate to other experiences.
I hope so. You know, one of the issues that comes up in the film is about casting, right? Whether non-trans people should be cast in trans roles. And it's a very layered, nuanced conversation. But right now, for many reasons, from economic to power dynamics, to correcting the wrongs of the past, to actually having a better performance, you know, we really are trying to argue for prioritizing trans people when we're telling trans stories. And there have been a number of times that famous non-trans celebrities are getting cast, and then there's a big groundswell talking about that. And just this week, there was press around Halle Berry getting cast to play a transgender man. And within a day, she changed, you know, once this became a public conversation, she realized the consequences of that, and that it wasn't the ethical thing to do. And she turned, you know, she decided not to do it. So that's a start, right? That's a start of people taking responsibility for those mistakes.
There was a question that came up in our chat box about public institutions that lack diversity around LGBTQ issues, and what people who are involved in larger institutions can do to promote inclusivity.
What can people in larger institutions do to promote inclusivity? You know, I think the thing about inclusivity is that as soon as it's something that's like added on, it's never going to have legs. Like, it has to be part of the fabric of everything that any organization is doing, right? So trans people in particular, what I love most about the community of trans people is that there's overlaps with every identity, with every culture, with every ethnicity, with every religion. We are everywhere, right? And we have every job, and we are in every relationship. So including trans people in your organizations, it should be just part of how we're thinking about the organization the system that our organization lives within. And so, you know, from who we're voting for and how they think about trans lives to how we're building the board of our organization should reflect the people that are making it. And if you look around and you're not seeing a trans person, there's a problem, right? Because trans people have in some way contributed to this history. So I'm sure there are people who, you know, their professional careers are based on giving advice in these situations.
Your professional career is making films.
But I think with my approach to filmmaking, that, you know, you can't tease out race, class, and gender. These things are always happening at the same time. And that would be my approach to anything that's involving culture, right? You cannot tease out one identity from the rest.
Well, let me get in one more question before we wrap up, but someone in the Q&A section is asking about editing choices, because the film is representing some, you know, really violent, you know, horrible scenes in mainstream media, and you know, and then cutting back and forth between those and interviews. This person asking, you know, I think felt, you know, jarred by some of that, and wanted to know, you know, what kind of sensitivity you applied to how you framed that, you know, those, you know, really, you know, disturbing sections that you're quoting.
You know, that is something that I started thinking about at the beginning of this project, and I'll probably think about it for years. And I constantly questioned, am I furthering the harm, you know, by telling this story? And ultimately what I keep coming back to is, not only are we seeing trans people telling this story, holding this story, guiding this story, empowered, brilliant, beautiful trans people, but there's also something that can be potentially really cathartic about seeing all of this in one place in a context, right? Seeing all this hate and shame and violence that you've internalized for so long, seeing it in one place outside of you, I think can help you move past it in a way you haven't before. And that's for non-trans people and trans people alike. We've all taken this in, and it's affected all of our ideologies around how we see trans people. So ultimately, I think it's a painful history, and it's painful to watch and witness. And there are times that I do look away still, you know, when watching the final cut. But I do think it's important that we know it and that we interrogate it, and we can't erase it and pretend it didn't happen. And it deeply affects how trans people exist.
For my last question, I understand when you were staffing up your project, you were, of course, using as many trans contributors as you could, and that you had a policy in place for when you were using someone on your crew who wasn't trans. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is something that's so important to me, and something I want to figure out a way to instill across the industry. Not only did we only interview trans people to tell the story in front of the camera, but we prioritized hiring trans people. And when we couldn't hire a trans person, we mentored a trans fellow. So we had a fellowship program. And in addition to that, everyone was paid, right? So the fellows were given, you know, honorariums and stipends, and everyone we interviewed was paid. Because I do believe we are, you know, there has to be when we're interviewing people, we're taking their life experiences, we're taking their expertise, and they could be working somewhere else. This is work, right? They could be making money somewhere else. They could be sharing their experience elsewhere. They have to be compensated for their time. And likewise, everyone behind the camera has to be compensated for their time. And so our budget was really big for this project because it was so important to pay everyone their day rates and to train more trans people so that they can get a foot in the door and have a start into the industry.
Well, that's great. I hope everyone gets to watch Disclosure. It's been up on Netflix just for a week or so now, but yeah, it's a great film, and I really thank you for it. And so thanks again for joining us today, Sam.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
Okay. All right, we're gonna move on to our third and final guest. Before I bring her up, let me say a few words about Judith Helfand. She's been making films for over 25 years. Her first documentary was her own personal story called A Healthy Baby Girl. That film goes back to when Judith's mother was pregnant with her. She was prescribed a drug that would have lasting consequences on Judith's health. And that link between institutions that affect our health and the outcomes in personal lives is a recurring theme in Judith's work that runs through films like Blue Vinyl and Everything's Cool, and her latest film, Cooked: Survival by Zip Code. Judith, besides being a filmmaker, is also a co-founder of Working Films that serves audience engagement, and she co-founded Chicken and Egg that supports women filmmakers. Her film Cooked: Survival by Zip Code had its world premiere at DocNYC in 2018 and was broadcast on PBS's Independent Lens. It's going to be rebroadcast next week on July 13th for the 25th anniversary of Chicago's deadly heat wave of 1995, which is a departure point for the film. Let's look at the trailer before I bring on Judith. Okay. I can't even tell you how many. Here we go.
What's the best way to prepare for disaster? It's a question lots of people are asking these days as the planet heats up and we face one unprecedented disaster after another. My interest in disasters started with one specific disaster that took place in Chicago in July 1995, one of the deadliest heat waves in US history so far.
We go to extremes in Chicago, and that's why people love Chicago. We go to extremes.
I walked into the room and I saw my grandmother lying across the bed, face up. I looked over at the window and it was nailed shut.
sexiness for the news media was it was about the heat. But the real story is, why were people in these neighborhoods dying? People weren't dying on the north side. People weren't dying in the Gold Coast. People were dying on the south and west sides.
The minute you see the refrigerator trucks, that means there's so many dead bodies that the coroner doesn't have room for them anymore. That's enough.
I think it's really about the heat.
It's not really about the heat. There is no need for as much poverty in our community as there is.
It's a story about these deeper social fault lines that make some members of a city vulnerable and keep others protected and blissfully ignorant about what's happening to people who live quite close to them.
Do you think they're addressing that?
Do I think the city is addressing the extreme poverty in communities of color in Chicago? Is that what you're asking me? Don't be ridiculous.
So what's the best way to prepare for disaster? I guess it depends on where you live.
Here I am, Judith. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
Your 6-year-old daughter's room, I think we've found you.
Yes, I'm straight from Judith Helfand's bedroom.
So, you know, we've all read statistics about how natural disasters are disproportionately affecting poor communities and communities of color. And, you know, rather than accept that as reality, you really set out to explore how that could be changed. And I'm curious what you found in that process.
Well, I guess what I found was that, I mean, it's the same thing that people are calling for now, that we tried to embed into the film, and we're trying to embed into the engagement, which is the idea that, you know, if we invest in the communities that we structurally divested from with redlining and for generations, those communities would be much better off every single day. A real economy would flourish, people would flourish. If we invest in schools and libraries and the organizations that are right now addressing the life and death situations that are occurring all the time, specifically and particularly all the underlying health problems that we hear about now and why some people are getting COVID and other people aren't. If we did that level of real investment, then, you know, the people who are being hurt the most every single day would have a better chance of flourishing every single day, let alone during a disaster. So, you know, I chose this story because I had never heard at the time of an extreme weather event revealing the underlying disaster and man-made crisis of structural racism. And I was like amazed that a heat wave could do that. But, you know, that was in 2003. In the world, you know, we've gotten used to quote unquote natural disasters doing that. And I think, you know, this moment with COVID is just helping us all see what is there every single day, all of the time, and is a life and death crisis, public health crisis every single day.
So that timeline is interesting. You started this in 2003. This was before Hurricane Katrina, even before, you know, any number. I mean, my understanding is that while you were making this, it was a little disorienting for you that there were so many, you know, new disasters time and again.
I mean, well, was it disorienting? I mean, it just, it was actually quite orienting. I mean, it made it very clear, this is the right story, we should be telling it. And it pointed out the travesty that it takes a quote unquote natural disaster to push all of us to see what's really there all the time, because it's easy not to see. And I think you can, you know, we try to do that even in the trailer. You know, we're juxtaposing one side of town and the other side of town, and, you know, the beautiful skyline, you know, and lakefront eclipses
what's really going on the south and west sides of the city. And I think, unfortunately, you know, until a disaster strikes that is palatable and easy for us to actually look at, or do we have the capacity and the capability of being able to look underneath? So, you know, I saw that in every disaster. I mean, I started shooting in earnest in 2005, and 6 weeks later, Katrina happened, and then Sandy happened, you know, and here we are right now. And essentially, it's all the same map, one on top of another. And that's why we thought, in a way, when the movie had its premiere on Independent Lens, okay, so that happened in February. You know, we thought, okay, you know, we'll continue to work with this movie, but all of a sudden with COVID, the underlying significance of this film and what it points out is really the same thing that we're learning right now. And so all of a sudden there's been a lot more interest, and PBS decided to rebroadcast it next week and to stream it for the next year, starting on the 25th anniversary of the heat wave.
One of the things I love about your films is the way you ask people questions, and you're putting yourself in your films. And your early films were about you and your family, so it was natural. Now this is not a personal story, except to the extent that it affects all of us. But you know, I've described to you that one of my favorite films in Cooked is you're talking to a military person who's been brought into a disaster zone, and you ask them the equivalent to the question of, you know, well, you know, what if you came into this community before a disaster happened and applied all those resources to fixing that community? And it's a question that feels like he's never been asked before, and is it's got humor to it, and it's you know, it's disarming, and I love that moment. But I wonder if you can talk about, you know, your role in your films, and you know, how you see yourself that way.
Well, I mean, I think my role in Cooked is different than my role in my other films. And actually, I just launched another movie, which is very much about me and my family, called Love and Stuff, which had its world premiere at Hot Docs. But essentially, the world premiere was like from the bedroom, from the kitchen. I mean, I haven't really been out of the house, as you well know. My role in Cooked, I mean, I didn't start out putting myself in this movie, but one thing became incredibly clear. The deeper we got into making the movie and the more dots we connected, I was connecting them as a white person. And at some point I realized, oh my goodness, I actually wouldn't even be making films if not for redlining. Like, my parents were able to get this little loan, a $15,000 loan, on this very small little modest ranch, and lived in it for 43 years in Merrick, Long Island. And they were specifically moved to a white neighborhood, you know, 100% white neighborhood next to an 80% black neighborhood. And I don't know if they understood what was going on. I certainly didn't until I was in my 20s, and it sort of all came to me in a way. But not until I made this movie did I realize that, wow, this movie is actually being made because I'm a beneficiary of redlining. And it put me in a position of feeling like, okay, I am taking the white community and my white Jewish community, because this movie sort of made the Jewish film festival circuit, I'm taking them on this trip with me to connect these dots, because we have to do that. So my role in this movie is sort of, I'm an instigator, I push a little, I ask uncomfortable questions, I ask questions that I know people might be thinking in their head, but they don't say out loud. I give them the chance to be uncomfortable along with me, because as I say in the movie, talking about race and class is not exactly comfortable for anyone, but especially in the context of this, when I'm saying, like, well, what if we redefine disaster? What if we decided that the disaster was the redlining or the structural racism or extreme poverty or the lifespan gap? Like, what if we just say that? Then what if we redefine and reframe disaster preparedness as investing in communities that are dying every single day of treatable diseases? You know, you know, the answer to that is, well, that's not how it works. You know, and my answer to that is, well, why not? I don't see why not. I mean, it's if those were laws that were created, they're laws that can be rewritten. And it's not like the disaster preparedness world has so much money. I mean, people would then say, you're barking up the wrong framework. But I still don't think so, because people don't get excited about HUD. Like, HUD doesn't have disaster in the, in the title. And people understand disaster. And people, they really do. And they are moved by it in certain ways. And I was really trying to get at that. So I guess my role is a provocateur, and hopefully a respectful listener.
I mentioned in my introduction that you are co-founder of Working Films, an organization that's dedicated to help bringing films to communities. And I'm not sure when I first heard the film outreach being applied to films, but I wouldn't be surprised it was from you, because it's always been a part of your work. I'm curious how that kind of community outreach, has played out with this film, and also how it's, how you're seeing it happen now that we're all inside our own homes, having to communicate this way.
Well, I mean, we've been trying as hard as we can to embrace this virtual moment, to utilize the fact that since we can't travel, we could actually all be together. So there are some benefits to that. So, as soon as we could, we had all these opportunities to bring the film physically to places in the spring leading up to this anniversary, and we tried to turn them into virtual events. So, we were able to be in Detroit and Arkansas, and Boston very easily, and to bring a lot more people to the table than we might have been able to otherwise. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, we coordinated this thing called the Summer of Extremes. And it was a conference, it was a convening, 3 nights, 90 minutes each, really trying to look at this moment when extreme heat and the anniversary of this heat wave collides with COVID-19. And what does that mean? And what will heat emergency plans look like at a moment when we're being pushed to stay physically distant? But what does that mean if you actually, quote unquote, need a cooling center, or if you don't have air conditioning, or if you want to go outside and you need to go outside, but you're afraid to go outside? So, we wanted an opportunity to kind of bring people together, and it wound up being really interesting. I don't think we couldn't have done that, right? We couldn't have brought all these viewers from all around the country were watching people that were primarily in Chicago. We couldn't do that otherwise. So I'm excited about that. I miss the human contact desperately. It's just me and my kid and our gracious babysitter who moved in because I couldn't work and do homeschool at the same time. But I miss the face-to-face, but I do feel like we're able to utilize this moment. And I think I proved that to myself with the Summer of Extremes, which was a big undertaking. And it was a really interesting opportunity to seed the idea for journalists that you can't tell the story of this anniversary of the heat wave without looking at COVID, without taking these maps and collapsing them together, without looking at this repetition of who gets hurt the worst and why it's always the same. And so, our offering is to take this moment and make it as intersectional as possible, and to not allow anybody to think about extreme heat without thinking about extreme racism and extreme poverty, which has always been the case, but not always talked about.
Judith, before we wrap up, let me ask one more question about your new film that you mentioned, Love and Stuff, that just premiered at the Hot Docs Festival, will be coming to other film festivals later this year. Can you just describe briefly what Love and Stuff is about? And
sure. I mean, I brought some props from the kitchen. Love and Stuff is all about not being able to let go of the stuff of the people that you love the most in the world, because somehow you think that inside the stuff is their soul. It's not true, I figured that out. But it's an intergenerational love story between me, my mother, and my daughter. And it grew out of a short that I did for the New York Times Op Docs called Love and Stuff, when I was faced with having to go all through my mother's stuff right after she died. And I realized that I was walking through a threshold that led me to be with everybody who's ever lost a parent or a loved one. And going through the stuff is this thing you have to do. And my mother had begged me to do it with her before she died. And I couldn't deal with the reality of going through that stuff, knowing that the closer she got to being at peace without having to worry about that, the closer she was to her death from metastatic cancer. So I took what was horrible and turned it kind of into a comedy, which is what I like to do, and brought people that I love together, like, you know, Dan Gold and Judy Karp, and said, and Julie Parker Bonello and Hilla Medaglia, and said, I'm going through something big, let's do this together. And then right when I thought, you know, Love and Stuff the short was done, my daughter arrived, and I had 24 hours, I had 3 hours to say yes, and 4 days later she came home, and this room, which you're in, which looks pretty good right now, was packed to the gills with my mother's stuff and every element from every movie that I'd made for 30 years. And there was no space for the kid. So that led to me really looking at stuff, baby stuff, mom stuff, my stuff, the stuff of life. And the movie is a story about being imperfect and accepting the fact that we're a work in progress, and parenting is hard, and love is hard, and stuff is hard, and we all have to do it.
Yeah. Well, I really look forward to audiences getting to see Love and Stuff. Right now, they can watch Cooked. It's available this minute on Amazon Prime, or you can watch it on PBS.
And right, next week it starts being for free for a year. I'm happy to say that. It's a very useful movie for this moment. If anyone is interested in bringing Summer of Extremes to your community, we're down to do that. And if you're interested in a stuff workshop, Rafaela went through one. And I'll be doing that with Love and Stuff, because we have to work from our homes in any way we can right now, right?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us from your home, Judith, and for sharing these films with us.
Thank you. And thank you for doing this. Friday Fix is an extraordinary addition to everything you're doing, and the community needs it. And it's been amazing to see who's in the chat. Hello, everyone.
Yes. Yes.
I love Friday Fix too.
Certainly keeping my week focused. All right, I'll say goodbye to you, and I'll just say some notes before we go. Thank you very much, Judith.
Thank you.
So I want to remind you that past episodes of Friday Fix are available on YouTube. You can watch them all for free, the past 9 episodes. I also always remind you to sign up for our Monday memo at docnyc.net that delivers the week's documentary news to your inbox. Also want to remind you that our friends at Firelight Media have their own Friday show, Beyond Resilience, that happens at 4 o'clock today. I think their RSVPs usually cut off at 3:30. We've just posted in the chat the link to that. This week they're talking about undocumented stories of undocumented people in the United States. So please check that out. Next week, we are gonna take a skip week. We're gonna move to a bi-weekly schedule for Friday Fix. Personally, next week, Raphael and I will be on vacation, a much needed one. But we will be back on July 24th with a new Friday Fix, so stay tuned to our social channels for that. I wanna give a big thanks to our guests, Dawn Porter, Sam Feder, and Judith Helfand. You can watch John Lewis' Good Trouble now on VOD, watch Disclosure on Netflix, look out for Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, coming to PBS streaming next week, and it's also on Amazon Prime. Thanks to the DocNYC team, Asha Phelps of the IFC Center for her support, and Dor Dotson, Sarah Moto, Caitlin Boyle, and Raphael Nehausen. I hope to see you back here in 2 weeks. And until then, be well.